I'm very pleased to welcome our first external speaker of the term, Melanie Jones, who's a professor in the economics section at Cardiff Business School. Do not forget, it's the public value business school. Okay, so got an accent to live up to here. Apart from a year in Sheffield, Melanie's career has been in Swansea. For those of you who don't know, Swansea is a place way over there. Takes a long time to get to, right? And does lots of things. For example, currently in the service mold is currently editor of the British Journal of Industrial Relations. She's a member of the Council of the Royal Economic Society, an ESRC grant panel. She's on the review body of doctors and dentists remuneration. Yes, and she's now an LS fellow and member of their economic experts working group. But Melanie, I think we call herself an applied labour economist, but her specific interests have been in gender equality and in the interactions between health and the labour market. And she's got loads of publications on both these things. For example, just this year, papers with titles like the UK gender pay gap, does firm size matter? The dynamics of disability and benefit receipt in Britain, the gender pay gap, what can we learn from Northern Ireland, and COVID-19 and the labour market outcomes of disabled people in the UK. She's effectively going to talk about one major on disability, but with the labour market aspect as well. So Melanie, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both for the invitation to present here today and for that really warm introduction. It's lovely to be here in person. I believe this is my first seminar post-COVID, so obviously bear with me. Like Stephen said, I've got really a long-standing interest in labour market inequality. Disability has been at the core of that. The work I'm actually going to present here today it deals with the issue of trade unions, so disability inequality and trade unions, and I know much less about trade unions, so I'm very happy to have your kind of constructive comments around the use of trade union membership in this work. In terms of, I guess, the background to this, so talking about disability, I'm talking about kind of a protected characteristic of a limited long-term health problem. I'll come on to the precise definitions that I use in the paper, but there's a long-standing literature in the UK and internationally about the disadvantage associated with disability in the labour market. Probably the most prominent indicator of that has been in terms of employment. So employment rates amongst disabled people in the UK are around about 50% compared to about 80% for non-disabled people. And that disability employment gap, even though it's been the subject of quite intense policy scrutiny, select committee inquiries, has really been quite persistent. The kind of disadvantage in the labour market doesn't end with employment, and there are plenty of studies that go beyond employment to look at in-work outcomes, including, I know, work that's been done by your colleagues, so things like the disability pay gap. There's a disability gap in terms of the experience of work, with disabled people reporting less positive outcomes. In terms of that work, there's quite an established literature which then tries to unpick that and finds that we can't explain the vast majority of those gaps. So there's potential for a role for discrimination against disabled people in the labour market. At the same time, there's a literature with which I'm far less familiar with on the role of trade unions, but I guess the most prominent of that is the kind of idea that you get a trade union wage premium. So again, comparable workers, those who are union members tend to earn more, and there's investigation into the reasons behind that. One of the themes within that literature that I've picked up on is this idea of unions as protecting particularly those kind of low wage workers. So there's been some arguments that trade unions potentially compress gender pay gaps, so act as a kind of sword of justice in relation to protecting those of low income, which would disproportionately then be individuals in protected characteristics. So putting those two things together, we might think that there's a role for trade unions in terms of disability inequality in the labour market. How might that work? Well, we can think of a range of kind of direct mechanisms through which that might work. There are kind of equality representatives within unions that promote kind of legislation. There are actually disability champions, so those who have particular expertise on disability issues related to the legislation, who try to inform both employees of their rights and also employers around their kind of responsibilities in regard to legislation. At the same time, there are arguments that unions kind of facilitate people in terms of exercising their rights, particularly in the context of gender. So there might be a role for unions in promoting disability rights at work. But there are also potentially more indirect mechanisms. So if we think of unions as particularly protecting the kind of pay of low-paid workers disproportionately, then you might see a compressed wage distribution in the context of unions, and that might disproportionately impact on disabled employees since they have lower pay on average. Other arguments or other mechanisms by which that could work through, well, if we think of unions as a kind of voice for employees in terms of management, then it might be disabled people particularly don't have the strength of voice that are kind of benefiting from that kind of collective representation in management. There are counter arguments, so there are arguments that by focusing on the kind of common issues, you neglect the kind of individual issues associated with disability. But I think the kind of strength of argument is that trade unions would advance equality in the labour market. If we get that, then we might get kind of disproportionate benefits to disabled people, which give rise to an incentive to join a union. Whether those benefits are real in terms of outcomes or perceived in a kind of cost-benefit model of joining a union, if you think that the cost is being fairly similar between individuals, if there are disproportionate benefits, you might get a concentration of disabled people joining unions. The other thing that you'd expect if these outcomes are real, if we look at inequality in the labour market, you'd expect the indicators to demonstrate less inequality amongst unions. Having said all that, if you look at the literature on disability, you might in some studies see disability as a control variable. Some studies ignore it completely. If you look at the literature, which I've seen on kind of determinants of trade union membership, you very rarely see disability indicators included in that analysis. So the interaction between them has largely been ignored in the international literature, studies in the UK and internationally. If we do look at the studies that look at the interaction, at least in the UK, more of those studies are from a kind of HR perspective. So there are a couple of studies which have really looked at the impact on equality practice, so management practice at the workplace. Some have tried to evaluate the role of equality representation or disability champions. They generally do that through kind of self-reported information from the disability champions themselves, who report then whether they've been able to influence management. Their responses have been positive, and I've seen qualitative work around the extent to which they're supported by employees, again, positive perceptions of these disability champions amongst employees. There's also work using the Workplace Employment Relations Survey, which tries to look at relationship, again, at an organisational level between unions and equality practices. And even if you restrict that to disability-related equality practice, there's a positive relationship. So unions seem to be associated with greater monitoring of disability outcomes within the workplace. What that literature doesn't do so much is look at the individuals. The one study which is the most closely related to my work is the US study, and that US study does essentially highlight the fact that there's a real lack of evidence relation between disability and equality and trade unions, and so looks at the current population survey in the US to document gaps in membership. So they find quite a small positive gap in membership. So disabled people are more likely to be union members, but that's entirely a function of essentially their personal characteristics and where they work. So after adjusting for that, we don't find any kind of unexplained gap in terms of union membership. Nevertheless, we find in the US evidence that the disability pay gap is lower amongst union members. So there seems to be an effect in terms of reducing inequality, even after accounting for all those kind of composition effects. And they also found a positive role in terms of job retention, but not in terms of hiring. So consistent with the idea that unions essentially protect their the interests of their members to a greater extent. They support disabled people in terms of job retention, but they're not able to increase the hiring of disabled people. That's very consistent with arguments in the UK, which is qualitative evidence, which they really see a role for unions in terms of disability and the kind of organisational priorities, but they believe that it will be largely through protecting the rights of workers rather than necessarily addressing employment by changing hiring practices. So what do I try and do? At the intersection of the two literatures, try to join them together, the literature on unions and disability labour market inequality, by doing, in a very similar way to the US study, looking at membership. So are disabled people more likely to be members in the UK? I'm using large-scale secondary data, so the advantages that we can control for a lot of other things that are going to be potentially related to disability and union membership. Is it disability, or is it just something like age or education that's potentially correlated with disability? And then one of the nice things about the data set and the WERS data set that I'm going to use is that it also asks about perception. So not just your actual membership, but what I'll call preferences towards union representation. So we can look at whether they're consistent with differences in membership and the mechanisms through which we might expect a membership gap. And then the final thing, I look at established measures of inequality in the labour market, and are they different essentially between members and non-members? And I pick up on the disability pay gap and employment retention as two mechanisms by which you might expect unions to have an impact and kind of core labour market outcomes, disability employment gap and disability pay gap. So to do that, I use two surveys. The main kind of household labour force survey, quarterly labour force survey in the UK, with the largest household sample size of private households, self-reported information on a really rich set of personal characteristics and work-related characteristics of individuals. And I pool that data, so between 2013 and 2020, but focus on a cross-section. So there is a small panel element to the quarterly labour force survey, which I am going to use in part. But essentially, most of the analysis is just done on a cross-section, a pooled cross-section over time. What the advantages of the labour force survey? Well, it's sample size, but particularly that it has the most established and kind of official measures of disability and trade union membership. So the kind of data that the government has or publishes on disability and trade union membership, it comes from that source. So we're using established differences. I've got a whole host of control variables, and to look at employment retention, I also use the panel element of that labour force survey. So it's really short. It's not designed as a long longitudinal survey, but it has got a short panel element of 5 waves, which allows me, because union membership is asked in 1 wave per year, I can pick up annual transitions in relation to employment retention. We complement that with data from WERS. So the WERS data is now quite dated. That's the most recent in the WERS series. We do that because it is linked data, so it has much more information on the employer. So it's linked employee-employer data. Not only does it have much more information about the workplace, but also I can control the workplace risk effects. So I can look at within a workplace, are these gaps still evident? And in addition to that, it's got information because it's much more interested in I guess, industrial relations. It's got information about perceptions of unions and some subjective information that I can also pick up from that survey. In terms of the key measures, so at the core is the definition of disability. I said it's a long-term health problem and it is restricted in some way. So that's a kind of general definition. Throughout this work, I'm going to show you estimates based on activity limiting disability. That is aligned to the legislation. So the 2010 Equality Act is activity limiting. The other potential definition you can use is work limiting, which is available in the LFS, and actually the findings are quite robust to the definition. There's quite a degree of overlap, but because we get consistent information in WERS and the LFS, I'm using the definition alike legislation, which is also what the government targets in terms of its labour market inequality measure. Everybody's got a long-term health problem which lasts more than 12 months. They're restricted in their daily activities, either a little or a lot. The actual nature of the questions differs between two surveys. In the LFS, it's a two-part question. So, do you have a long-term health problem? Those who say yes, then get the follow-up question, does it restrict their daily activities? In WERS, it's a single question, but to all intents and purposes, it's designed to capture the same thing. The prevalence in the LFS at about 14%, and these are, I've conditioned the sample, they're working age employees. So the rate is low here relative to the total population, but that's because they're in work, because we're looking at union membership. It's higher in the local survey than it is in WERS for at least two reasons, I think. The first one is that WERS is earlier and disability prevalence in the UK is rising. The second one, I think, is because WERS is distributed through the workplace. So I think there is much more of a tendency to associate that with potentially the employer than even though it's not, and it's an anonymous survey, it doesn't go back to the employer. Quarterly labour force survey is always done through the household, so it's certainly not connected to the employer. There's quite a debate about the use of subjective self-reported information on disability in the literature, not least because you've got measurement error, you've got individuals with exactly the same health conditions, it's the same sort of personal circumstances might respond to the question differently. That measure is expected to downward bias any estimates, but working in the opposite direction, there's an argument called justification bias, which is that people, particularly with inferior labour market outcomes, might have an incentive to justify those on the basis of disability, so an incentive to over-report. That's more used when we're thinking about things like welfare and non-employment. So we condition the sample on employees, so it's likely to be less of a problem. Nevertheless, it can still be true if we're dealing with things potentially like wages. I think it's going to be less problematic in the case of unions, where you might think, you know, what's the logic for kind of exaggerating or justifying union membership or not. In the case of union membership, the same question, identical question is asked in both surveys. Is, are you a member of a trade union or staff association? So seems to be typical in the literature that staff association is included. The responses, I think, in the LFS are yes, no. So we're dealing with current members versus everyone else. In WERS, we've also got the option to be a former member, but for the purpose of this, you're either a member or not a member. Again, the rates do differ between the surveys. So we've got about 25% of our sample in the labour force survey, nearer 30% in WERS. But there are differences in terms of the geographic coverage of the two surveys, the timing of the two surveys, that may well give rise. And WERS also has some restrictions to larger workplaces. So there are potential explanations for differences between them.
Clarifying question, when you benchmark is, say, if it is the timing, you try to understand the differences between the two surveys, because it seems that in both, both questions you have this difference. And
you can't with disability because the question changes in 2013, which is, I should have said, motivates the start of my period. You can in there, some people have them. So I think when you account for various things, WERS doesn't sample some industries. I think it restricts it to more than 5 employees, and the bigger the firm, the more likely to have a union. Then it narrows it, but I don't think there's no discrepancy. Okay, but that's kind of established.
Yeah.
We use membership, and the results that I'm going to show you are all related to membership. Of course, there are other measures of unionisation. So you can look at presence. Both surveys have measures of presence, but they're different. So in the LFS, you're essentially asked if other people at your workplace are in a union. In WERS, I think it's much more a formal question of presence of a trade union. There's a lot more concern about measurement error when we're dealing with sort of the presence of a trade union. And both ask about coverage. Again, they ask in different ways, and in WERS, they ask the manager about coverage rather than the employee. So I do some analysis with the alternative measures, but predominantly I'm looking at individual membership. I won't go into anything like the depth for the other variables. So it's a working age employee sample. WERS contains information on union perceptions, which I'll come back to when we look at the results, the detailed nature of the questions. But essentially, they ask about who you want to represent you. So a general question to everyone. But then they also ask more for those who have a union present in the workplace, a reflection on the kind of effectiveness of the union. So two different things, one about general preferences for union, and then one a bit more evaluative of the kind of impact of unions. In terms of inequality, I already said we're looking at pay, so we use hourly pay. It's self-reported in both surveys. It's constructed from weekly pay, adjusted for hours of work. In WERS, it's a banded question. So I use the midpoint of the band and divide by hours. That has previously been shown to be very similar to using interval regression, but there are measurement errors in relation to hourly pay. The information on employment retention I take from the longitudinal element for labour force survey, and the longitudinal element is where they extract a balanced panel subsample from the LFS. So it's a much smaller sample than the original LFS, but then you can get employment status 1 year apart. And so I look at essentially those individuals who start out employed and whether they remain in employment 1 year later. I also use a measure of job retention as well as employment retention. Then in terms of the strength of the data, we have quite a comprehensive set of control variables. I try and keep it consistent. So obviously information in WERS and the quarterly labour force survey have slight differences in definition, but in terms of personal characteristics, we pool across gender. Again, I have done some analysis which splits it out. Obviously, there's established literature about gender differences in the labour market, but we control for gender at a minimum. Things like age related to disability and union membership, qualification, ethnicity. We've got a whole set of job-related characteristics, things like your sector. And again, I do it separately by sector, public and private sector, but for the main set of results, they're pooled. There's a control for sector, workplace size, the type of contract you're on, so whether you're part-time, temporary, what region you work in, job tenure. Again, we can control for occupation and industry using the standard classifications, and in most of the results, we use the broad occupation and industrial groups. And then finally, for WERS only, I've got more detail about the workplace. I do present some specifications where we have workplace characteristics, but I think probably the advantage of WERS is that we can control for these workplace fixed effects, and we can add within workplace differences then. So just to keep the notation straightforward, so in the LFS we do have a time dimension and we have yearly dummies throughout. In WERS we have a workplace dimension. Again, I've dropped that notation just to make it consistent, but essentially the first thing that we do is we look at union membership, and we look at it as a function of disability and a whole range of other control variables, which we successively build up in the model. So the parameter of interest there is the alpha. We're interested in whether disabled people have a lower or higher probability of membership after conditioning on other things. I estimate the models using OLS, so it's a linear probability model. That's for a couple of reasons. The results are very similar if you use probit models and get marginal effects, but essentially here you can have the workplace fixed effects. We can also, in the next set of models, include interactions. And because other than looking at like union membership on its own, we can also look at then preferences for unions and also union effectiveness, which is actually a rank scale, a subjective rank scale of how well you think the unions are doing. Union preferences amongst everyone. Union effectiveness is only for a sample where there are unions present in that workplace. So the table is quite cumbersome, but essentially you've just got the two data sets. So the quarterly labour force survey in the top, WERS is in the second panel, and all the table does is add more. So if you go for column 1, what you'll see is we have no covariance. Essentially, we're dealing with a raw disability gap in membership. Disability is positive and significant. So on average, disabled people are more likely to be union members. As we move through the columns, we had personal characteristics, job characteristics, occupation and industry, such that the coefficient on disability declines. It declines to a much greater extent in WERS though. So at the beginning, the disability gap in WERS is much larger than in the quarterly labour force survey, but it looks to be a result of composition effects. If we control for things, by the time we get to the other end of that table, the coefficient on disability is very similar between the two surveys. So about 3 or 4 percentage points, and actually it exists even in our final specification for WERS, which is comparable looking individuals within the same workplace. Disabled people are still more likely to be union members. And that gap in terms of percentage change, it was about 25% union membership is quite sizable. And given that disability is not typically controlled for it in these kind of models of union membership, it seems to be a neglected characteristic. So it's potentially consistent with unions having perceived or real benefits for disabled individuals. If we deal with the kind of preferences, so in WERS, everybody's asked about the preferences for representation to management. Trade unions are just one of a set of options. So you could have yourself, your line manager, a colleague. I'm just looking at trade unions. So essentially, here we're looking at those that report a trade union is best positioned to deal with issues. You can see the range of issues. So it's not one issue. You can deal with positive things like negotiating a pay increase at the same time as more negative issues, protection of pay, protection against reductions in hours. Top panel is just the first specification. So raw differential, no controls. The adjusted one here is just a fully adjusted model. So I've just missed out all the ones in between. And what you can see is consistent with higher rates of union membership. Disabled people are exhibiting preferences towards union representation. That comes at the expense of themselves. They're less likely to report themselves, and they're less likely to report their line managers. If we adjust for things, all those gaps are smaller. Some of it is composition, but actually all of them remain significant. So it doesn't matter the dimension, they're still favouring union representation. And we've got, again, even for relatively comparable workers, at least what we can observe, within the same workplace, they are expressing positive preference. The next slide is slightly different. It's WERS data, but here now the sample is much smaller. We're dealing with only individuals who have a union in the workplace, so much more reflective or evaluation of effectiveness of the union. And the question is, unions or staff associations at this workplace, and then there are 3 different elements to this. One is kind of how receptive they are to individuals, then how much impact they have. So are they taken seriously by management, and do they have a difference? And in contrast to what we've seen so far, in the top panel, the only raw differential that's significant is negative, so a less positive evaluation of unions than non-disabled individuals. The adjusted differential, though, is absent. So essentially, even though disabled people are reporting a preference for union representation, the kind of eventuality or the assessment of unions in the workplace isn't any more positive than non-disabled individuals. And that really takes me to the second element of the analysis, which is trying to establish what relationship there was between unions and kind of the measures, objective measures of inequality. So again, it's just an example of equation here. Here's a standard wage equation where we're looking at the interaction between disability and unions. So in this specification, we've got to control the disability, which will give you the disability pay gap. We've got a control for unions, which would give you your traditional union wage premium. But what we're interested in is the interaction. So the interaction between disability and unions, which you can interpret in two ways. I'll typically interpret it as, is there a differential in terms of the disability pay gap between union members and not? But another way of thinking about it is kind of that incentive in terms of union wage premium. Does it differ for disabled people? There's some debate about whether you should estimate these kind of models using OLS, whether actually union membership is endogenous, and the literature does both. I think there's also an equal concern that if you don't have a kind of valid instrument for unionisation, then you might actually be biasing your results further. And obviously I welcome your views on that. In terms of what I've done, I've also done some kind of endogenous switching where I've tried to identify unions on the basis of kind of union concentration in your industry at a very detailed level, but I think, like the literature, I don't have a particularly convincing instrument. The results look the same so far, so I'm just going to present the OLS wage equation. It's a log of hourly pay, and again, we introduce a whole set of controls. We have pay in both WERS and the quarterly labour force survey, so again, we can compare the results. In exactly the same way, we change the dependent variable and look at employment retention. So that's whether you start out in employment and you remain in employment a year later, and that's based on the longitudinal element of the labour force survey. But it's again the interaction. Are disabled people, or is the gap, disability gap in employment retention, more or less among union members? So we start with the pay gap, where we've got both quarterly labour force survey and WERS. There are fewer specifications here just to make it manageable, but the first one is your raw, no adjustment, and then your second one goes for full adjustment by personal characteristics, job-related characteristics, occupation, industry, and then the final column in WERS is the workplace fixed effects, which aren't available in the quarterly labour force survey. So the first column, the coefficient on disability is negative, the kind of standard disability pay gap that we get in the literature. Your union member has a positive pay premium, so they pay more on average, but it's only in the case of the quarterly labour force survey that the interaction between those two things is significant, and it suggests a narrowing disability pay gap where there's unions present. So consistent with the US evidence, at least at that stage, where there are narrower disability pay gaps where there are unions, some sort of protective role of unions. In contrast, though, if we look at WERS, that's not the case. And if we look at the adjusted versions in column 2, those effects disappear. So the disability pay gap narrows, which is quite standard in the literature. Some of it is part of composition effects, but an unexplained disability pay gap remains. The union premium only then exists in terms of the LFS and not the quarterly, not the WERS, and then it's much smaller. But the important thing is the interaction is not significant, and so after we account for other things, unions don't seem to be offering that protective role in terms of the disability pay gap in the UK like they did in the US. Exactly the same thing, except now it's employment retention, and the difference between the two panels: employment retention is you remain in employment, job retention is you remain within the same job. So employment retention allows you to change jobs, job retention doesn't. In the first panel, we have no controls. In the second column for each, we have a full set of controls. The samples are smaller here, they're based on the longitudinal element of the labour force survey. So in this case, we're not looking at controlling for workplace characteristics. We have a negative disability effect. So we have disabled people less likely to retain work in the next year. We have a positive effect of unions, so associated positively with job retention. But what you can see is that the interaction term is that kind of probability of disabled people, or the differential probability of disabled people retaining work differ if you're a union member or not, and it's not. So in contrast again to the US, we don't find any protective role of unions in relation to job retention either. So where am I? In terms of the analysis, I think we've got a fairly robust membership gap that exists for males and females. It exists in the private sector, in the public sector. The size of it, I think it was 3.6 percentage points. It is considerable in terms of percentage. It seems very suggestive of differences in benefits to unions for disabled people, and consistent with that, we get this evidence of differences in preferences for union representation. They don't carry through in terms of individuals' assessment of the performance of unions, which is actually very consistent then with what we find in terms of inequality, because we don't find an impact of unions in terms of reducing labour market inequality amongst disabled people, either in terms of pay or in terms of job retention. And they're obviously selective indicators, but nevertheless, they are two of the kind of key elements through which you might expect unions to work. So where does that leave? Well, there is this membership gap that we can't explain by a whole host of characteristics. What might be driving that, especially in the context of an absence of kind of benefits in terms of addressing inequality? Is there a greater benefit from being a union member in terms of consumption benefit? Is it out of frustration that individuals are joining unions? What are the kind of other plausible reasons for that membership gap? One of the kind of concerns that struck me was that if you've got positive preferences for unions, but then your evaluation is no stronger, well, is that actually misplaced? Are unions not doing what individuals perceive them to be doing? Then we've got a big question around inequality. Certainly for the two measures that we've got in the data set, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that unions are diminishing the size of disability related inequality. So is it that I'm not capturing the right things? Are unions not having an impact on inequality? Or actually, and I have seen particularly unions taking a much broader perspective about inequality, so not just protecting their members, but perhaps there's a national trade union campaign on the disability pay gap. So actually, are they having a role addressing disability inequality, but one that's not tied to membership or even coverage or anything that we measure, that they're improving the lives, I guess, of disabled employees on a whole? And given that equality legislation, the prior evidence in relation to disability is actually quite similar in the US and the UK. So there's a big disability employment gap in the US, there's a disability pay gap, which can't be explained in the US. There's similar kind of legislation around discrimination and reasonable accommodation. Why are the results quite so different? So in the US, their membership gap essentially goes to zero once you account for composition effects, which is different to what we find, which is a residual membership gap. And they find suggestive evidence of the effectiveness of unions, which we don't find at all. It might be something to do with the disability legislation, but I guess what I'm looking at more is for people's commentary about the nature of unions and the role of unions in different countries, and whether the kind of institutional features in that respect are potentially driving those results. So I think that's probably a good place for me to leave it. Thanks very much.
Great. Maria, are we going to move the camera or?
If Melanie sits,
Yeah. Complete with their question. Then, so Devaka, then Adam, then Berkay.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. Thank you. That was a great presentation. My question was with regards to the longitudinal data that you had, and I was wondering if that data records any increase or decrease of disability or the impact of disability over the two different time periods, and whether that would have an effect on the job retention or sector retention that you observed in the tables.
So yeah, we're restricted in what we can do with this because we've only got data at 2 time periods. We do have disability data at two time periods, and something I didn't mention as well, in the labour force survey, we do have indicators of type of disability and severity of disability. I didn't present those results, not least because kind of policy tends to focus on the binary measure of disability, but because in terms of the trade union membership, they actually look fairly similar across type. There is a relationship with severity, so the more severe, you're more likely to be a trade union member, but it doesn't seem to be the kind of core driver. In terms of what you're talking about perhaps the dynamic patterns of disability, so we are able to look at disability onset. We can obviously look at 2-period disability as a kind of more long-term measure of disability, but I thought the interesting elements might be disability onset to disability exit. Having said that, there's quite a lot of risk of measurement. I talked about the measurement error before. If you think about those people making the transitions, they're probably not representative of the group as a whole. So having said that, I think from what I can remember, we looked at disability onset in terms of the employment transitions, and the results were exactly the same if you look at those people who you might think of as greatest risk of leaving because they just had perhaps the onset of a disability, and again the interaction wasn't significant. So it didn't look that unions protected those disproportionately either.
Just let others go first. No, let others go first.
In order, your first step.
No, let Berkay go first because I was just going to try.
So yeah, mine is a very quick question. So in the interest of time, so one of the personal characteristics that might vary between 2 surveys is the migration background, migrant workers versus not. UK Labour Force survey includes a lot of migrant workers, and the worst doesn't include a lot of migrant workers. Actually, and I was wondering, like, when you don't adjust for them, their tendency to become the trade union members and reporting their disabilities might be very different than between these two surveys. Have you looked at it?
I haven't looked at it, so I control for ethnicity, but not migrant. I'm pretty sure you could do that in both surveys. And actually, there's a literature, I think, about migrant workers and reporting to trade unions, I think, as well. So yeah, there's no reason why we can't control. But I doubt it's driving the effects because we've already captured, I guess, some elements of demographic background. But yeah, absolutely, it should be included in this one. Thanks.
Going to ask?
Nobody else with a question?
Yeah, you go first and then Eva.
I was just going to ask a question to get everybody going, so it might not be a very good question. That's Eva, go save me here. And then I'll ask a question if nobody else has got a question.
Just ask a question. Adam. Come on, just ask.
Thanks very much for the talk. So I was wondering if you can say a bit more about differences by sector, and for example, how that matters in the UK versus the US. And so I know you control for sector, but what about differences within sector and disability? Does that play any role in the UK?
Okay, so I think what I did was, as extensions, I split the sample by gender and I split the sample by sector. So trade union membership is much higher in the public sector. So you just might think that they have slightly different roles across sectors. The patterns are the same in both sectors. I can't remember which way around it was. I think it was slightly stronger in one sector than another, but it's not driven by one sector or another.
And how does that compare to the US in terms of,
can't quite remember what they did in terms of their study, whether they included, I think they just included both sectors, but potentially yes, because the public sector is slightly different across countries, so it might be worth digging, but I don't think that's going to explain the kind of fundamental patterns that differ so much.
Thank you. Tanya, please, online.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much. Really clear presentation, very interesting. I got two questions. One was, I think the results you presented were for individual union membership, but you also mentioned that you could look at whether there was union representation at your workplace, I think, in both surveys. And I just wondered whether you'd also looked at the results using that rather than individual level union membership, the thought being that it could be that employers that know there's a union, ideally, of course, an active union in the workplace, might be a little bit more careful about sacking disabled workers or not making reasonable adjustments and so forth. So that was first question. Second question was, clearly it's very good reason for looking at pay gaps and employment retention, and those are indeed very important outcomes. But I wonder whether there are other kinds of outcomes which may be part of the reason why disabled people are more likely to, other things being equal, be union members, which would be around feeling heard, being treated with dignity, other kinds of outcomes about what it feels like to be in the workplace as a disabled person that are perhaps not captured by those harder economic outcomes. Thanks.
Yeah, no, so both good questions. In terms of the first one, yes, I've used all three measures. So when we look at the inequality measures that I think you're talking about in terms of the interaction, it doesn't matter what you use. So it's never significant whether you use representation, whether you use coverage, because like you might think terms and conditions are more affected by coverage. If we look at the incidence, so the kind of trade union membership, that doesn't matter in the LFS, so it doesn't matter. There's a higher incidence of both representation of coverage in the LFS. In WERS, it seems to be more sensitive, so the disability gap isn't necessarily robust across all the measures. I think partly that's due to measurement error. So if you look at the number of don't knows in relation to, I think it's union representation, it really reduces the sample size. So there might be something there, but there may be, WERS might signal that even though there's more union membership, there's not necessarily greater coverage or representation. In terms of your outcomes, I entirely agree. So the first thing that I thought about as an extension to this, because I've done work on kind of experience of work, and I thought about job satisfaction, but actually when you think of the union literature in relation to job satisfaction, unions are associated with lower job satisfaction. So the kind of logic doesn't work, but I could certainly look and see if in WERS particularly, there's probably going to be something like, I'm not sure if we could get voice directly, but something more consistent with being here heard at work. So yeah, thanks. I can certainly have a look what else we've got. Not so much in the LFS, but I think that might be another strength of WERS in terms of subjective measures.
Right, thanks. So I've got a couple of questions, if I might, Melanie.
I think you've got some comments.
Oh, so see, she put it up well.
I put it up late, yes. Yeah, no, I was still thinking. So really interesting. So I was trying to think about the questions you raised about why would this be, and I couldn't come up with any answers except, is there a potential that this could be a sort of compensatory action in some way, so that actually they'd be even worse off if they weren't? So in workplaces where they're expecting or feeling that they're particularly vulnerable, they become union members, and you don't get the net. You don't get the impact over on the pay gap, because in a sense that's still there, but that's there for sort of other sorts of employment as well. So it was just a thought, and that would be consistent with their preferences for representation, but also with them not necessarily thinking that the union is particularly powerful, because they're feeling kind of quite vulnerable anyway. It's just a speculation. But I was wondering if that follows at all.
Yeah, I think it follows, and I think you're right. It works in the opposite direction, doesn't it? To find. Yeah. Yes, it could be in anticipation. I guess I've always thought of how do you know in some senses, but what you're saying is that they have to have some instinct that their organisation is going to be particularly adverse in terms of the outcomes, and that certainly could, and I don't think we've got anything.
No, it's nothing, I don't think you would do that, no.
I'll think about it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just wanted to follow up on Lucinda's question. You have a lot of data on the workplace from the wearers. I'm not sure about the labor force survey. To try to get to a measure of how protective, I mean, I know you do the fixed effect, but at least to explore, you know, try to get a measure of how good these workplaces are, because you have historical data as well. You could build some sort of indicator and see whether there's something around.
Yeah, I don't think I can look at outcomes because the sample in WERS is small to do something like sort of disability pay gap at the organisational level, which I guess is what you want. But what I do have is, do you monitor pay by disability? Do you, and potentially, even though they're obviously imperfect measures of actual outcomes at the workplace, it might signal, like you say, these are good workplaces, and I could potentially split the sample or something around, are unions more effective in less equal workplaces or something.
Okay, Stephen. Yes.
Like, where is he?
A couple of points of clarification, and then a more speculative one. First of all, I was just wondering, does understanding society no good for in this area? Secondly, near the beginning, you said when you were talking about definitions, you referred to a particular measure of disability being related to a government target. I wasn't sure what the government target was. When if you elaborate, and that would, if you could then segue into the sort of more bigger policy implications of what you found, because in a way on your last slide, you said in quotes, no role for unions. So, okay, if we have a policy problem and there's no role for unions, what is there a role for?
Okay, so yeah, really hard question, the last one, but
Yeah.
Understanding society, I think potentially, as you get the nice longitudinal element, the sample's obviously going to be smaller, and it's just a case of working with another data set, another definition. So it's more a kind of, I think it would be good to have it, but whether or not it can go all in one paper, I guess it's a question. In terms of the government target, so the government have always been keen on this disability employment gap. They had a target quite a while ago to halve the disability employment gap. That relates to the Equality Act definition of disability, and it's measured by the LFS, so the data set's consistent. They subsequently come out to change the target for 1 million more disabled people in work, and I don't quite know what criticising that change, but they still are targeting that measure. In terms of policy implications, yeah, I was quite cautious not to say no role for unions, because unions operate in different ways, and I think when I saw kind of them raise the profile of the disability pay gap, which in contrast to something like the gender pay gap just doesn't get the same kind of either policy or academic attention, even though it's, you know, of not dissimilar size, then I have to be cautious about saying there's no impact. There's no impact in terms of membership coverage, at least on the basis of the data and of the measures that I have seen. Having said that, there is evidence to say that unions are associated with better equality practices at the workplace. So it's obviously in the round, is there a role for unions? What might work? Oh, that's a difficult question. So in terms of, I guess, a quantitative background, I am quite keen on organisations measuring disability, monitoring outcomes, and I think that's the only way we're going to find out what works within the workplace. And that's very consistent, I think, with greater government recognition of the demand side. So I think what we've seen a lot of kind of changes to welfare and that kind of supply side. There's still a role for things like education in relation to disabled people having lower average levels of education. But I think probably in terms of the policy package, what hasn't been looked at so much is the role of employers. And I think that employers currently aren't measuring and monitoring disability at all. So they're not doing it well where they try and do it, nothing like as well as kind of things like the gender pay gap. And until you, as an organisation, I guess, recognise and see what works in terms of addressing those things or raise the profile of those things, then I think that that's probably a good place to start.
Do you think, taking up on that one, there would still be the problems that there are, for example, with answers to a minority ethnic group type questions, where people sometimes don't want to answer the question. So that's the similar issues with disability.
Absolutely. So disclosures work, and that's, you know, that's something I probably should have said in terms of trade unions might encourage you to report a disability at work. But actually, neither of these surveys were about reporting them at work, so it's not as relevant in terms of the measurement issue. But there's a lot of work to be done on the definitions that we have in surveys. Disability is really sensitive, it's very difficult to measure, but all the work the ONS has done on getting good questions, they don't translate yet to employer. So I'm sure when you fill out your HR, it's something like, are you disabled? And you probably have to. So I think the first thing we've got to do is kind of detach that and make sure that the questions that employers are asking are, and actually they don't mention disability, they're asking people about long-term limited health condition. And that would tally. So what we're dealing with in terms of the policy outcome is also what employers are then interested in. And for me, I don't see how employers can be meeting their obligations under the providing reasonable accommodations, not discriminating unless they know in terms of the workplace. So I think employers have to make sure that they communicate that it's for good reason and for supportive reason that they're collecting that information, which is going to try. It will take time, but reduce the kind of why you collecting that information for maybe less positive reasons.
Thank you. Tanya, please.
I just wanted to come in on your conversation, Melanie and Stephen, and say that the way I read Melanie's conclusions is as a call to unions to do a better job. So we know that unions are effective at reducing inequalities in all sorts of different respects in workplaces. And if the evidence is that here in the UK, they're not doing that effectively in relation to disability, then they better get their act together. So the policy implications aren't necessarily policies for government. There could be policy implications for unions as well.
Thank you.
There's another one.
Is it Tom?
Yeah, thank you. Your last comment also just made me think about one as well, because I mean, how someone defines as disabled potentially depends on the organisation they're in and how inclusive it is. So is there potentially a risk that some of the people that you're speaking to in organisations which are inclusive, so if they've got maybe neurodiverse conditions, they would say they're disabled, whereas others are in organisations which aren't, so therefore they're not going to report as disabled in your sample? And I mean, I don't think you can deal with that, but your thoughts on that would be quite interesting, to be honest.
I think it's right. It's much more the case when you're dealing with a work limiting disability. So if you're using that definition, then things like workplace accommodations are much more important. What we're talking about is daily activity. So yes, work is one dimension, but it's only one of the possible elements which could be affected. So I think it's more modest in the definition than we use the other definition, which is work limiting. But there's no real, you know, I think at an organisational level, you can perhaps get a handle on things, but in terms of national data sets, it's quite difficult to try and establish. But it comes back to the point of trying to look at seeing if we can group organisations by some kind of pro-equality measure.
Yeah. Excuse my ignorance on the subject, but I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between the promotion at the workplace and disability, and also the relationship between some disabilities being more debilitating over a period of time, and you know, more responsibilities coming with sort of increase in time in workplace. So that kind of.
Okay, yeah, I don't think I'll get to exactly what you're getting at, but both pieces, I guess, have been investigated. So there's not a lot on promotion per se, but certainly when you look at occupational hierarchies, disadvantage in relation to disabled people, similar to the wage gap, you see an unexplained part of that. In relation to type of disability, we do see that some conditions, so in terms of groups of conditions, mental health problems would typically be associated with lower employment rates, bigger wage gaps. In terms of the interaction, and I think it's a good point that hasn't really been looked at a lot, is whether you're, so we know that sort of chronic disability or persistent disabilities have greater disadvantage associated to them. We know something about the age of onset of a disability, but what I think you're getting at is whether it's more manageable at a certain level within the organisation than at other organisations. And I guess you might broaden that out to within some occupations and others. What we know from the occupations is that mismatch is important. So it clearly depends on your abilities and the kind of demands of your job role. But I think what you're pointing to is also whether at a senior level in an organisation there's perhaps less inequality, which is an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that. I guess the problem, you'd have to separate people who have disability onset at quite a senior stage versus those who have had it at an earlier stage, and which then have been affected right through their progression through their career. But I think that's quite interesting.
Thanks.
Just another dimension. I know you're calling for gender. I was wondering, would it be interesting to look at the interaction between disability, union membership, and gender? Because we know that the gender gap is more salient, at least in the workplace, in terms of measurement and everything. So does that change something when you add a disability?
So I've done something similar. So I've estimated the model separately by gender, that and the wage gap, because obviously there's a big literature. In both cases, the relationships are the same. Again, there's a difference in size, but not in terms of the relationship. So it's evident for both men and women.
I was wondering more about the side, actually. Like if there was a massive.
If I could remember, don't quote me on that, but and it is in one of the appendices. I think it's greater for women.
Thomas.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'll get this right now in terms of the modeling. I'm just thinking one thing is, if there is such a thing as kind of a ceiling for how much wage gains unions can achieve in a workplace, then there could be something like, I mean, you don't see it in the raw associations either, but then there could be something like that. Maybe disabled people, they select into workplaces that are closer to that ceiling already, whatever reason. And since you're then controlling for workplace the characteristics, you're controlling away, in a way, that difference. So well, the interesting part would be basically, is there such a thing as kind of a linear effect of union membership for wages, or is there kind of a ceiling to some degree? And if you're thinking, especially if you're thinking that it's more about you have unions present in the workplace rather than the sheer number of union members, right? If it's more of there's a certain spillover, and if a workplace has union members, then there is an advantage for union members, and if not, then maybe not. Then there could be some kind of a ceiling to that, and then you have like I was the whole time I was just thinking, could there be some kind of selection problem?
Yeah, no, I certainly in terms of selection problem, there can be selection problems. The first thing is that the results with and without workplace fixed effects don't look very different.
Yeah.
So it doesn't look like that's accounting for a huge amount. In terms of, we don't just use membership, so we do use kind of presence and coverage. And in words, we've also got, I think, intensity, so like the percentage of, and it doesn't seem that's the inequality outcomes don't seem that sensitive to how it's measured. But I can certainly, think a little bit more about how people select.
I was just wondering, so most of the comparisons that Melanie has made between the US and the UK and whether or not you might expect to get similar results. 1. 2, I look around the room and the national backgrounds of much of our audience, and I wondered if anybody would speculate on how things would be similar or different in their countries with different sorts of legislation and so on.
I mean, immediately would think that in a lot of continental European countries, it's not about union membership, but rather, I mean, because a lot of the agreements are made at the industrial level or at the sector level, you will not find that large of an effect of single union membership. I mean, that's usually very large in the US, right? There's really like, you are a union member, you get the benefit. But I think in a lot of countries on the continent, it would rather be there's some kind of an umbrella effect for every worker, basically.
Any more?
Actually, for India, I wonder there'd be other factors affecting union membership. Here, there seems to be a direct effect of disability on union membership. But when we started the presentation, I was wondering, even lack of information with people with disabilities, would that impact, or lack of community would impact union membership? And accordingly, what kind of effect that would have on sort of job outcomes, on salary differences? Because union membership isn't there isn't that strong prevalence of union membership across different demographies. So, workers.
Yeah, I think because the sample is conditioned on employees, so we're already dealing with a group of people that I guess are in work and so are more familiar in terms of unions. But I think it probably does relate very much to kind of industry. You know, some industries it's very prevalent, you know, it's quite common to be a union member, and in others not. Can't imagine, you're right, you know, on average the kind of evidence suggests there's less, you know, social networks and things with disabled people, but I can't imagine that if you're in work in a workplace that necessarily the information would be that dissimilar.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, because you said before that you could go for this sector. I keep thinking about heterogeneity across industries, also because the union is very much related to the industry where you're at. Right? Have you explored that? Or, I mean, what you know, what I'm struggling with is that within workplaces, you still find that effect, right? So we can think about heterogeneity, but it's gonna be, you know, a heterogeneity across workplaces in sector or industry or other things, but I don't think that can explain the within workplace thing that you find. So
all I've done is have more detailed industry. So I've got specifications at the moment. They're kind of broad industrial groups. We've got much more detail, and in one specification I can't remember, I think it's 2-digit zip codes. So it doesn't seem to.
And interactions as well, or splitting something, seeing.
I could probably do more with it, but it doesn't seem to be making a huge difference.
Along those lines, that you said it, like maybe I missed it. Workplaces of smaller sizes are excluded, right? So the more than it has to be more than 5, but there must be also on the high end. The heterogeneity might be driven by the very, very large firms that are big players in the industry, and then the union negotiations and things might be very different. So we might want to have also the effect on very high, like I know job functions within that very large firms vary dramatically. In organizational structure, the people might be doing various different types of tasks that are amenable for like disability or not. So I was wondering whether we should be also looking at excluding of very big players out of the data.
Yeah, I could certainly split the part. I've got a control for firm size, I've got occupation in there. But yeah, we could look at, you know, 2 different bands of firm size and see if the results vary.
Thanks very much. Adam, do you have that finished question?
I'll make everybody suffer by listening to my terrible question. It's even worse now, isn't it? No, waiting so long for it. My name's Adam Oliver, actually. I'm based here. So it's just something I might misunderstand, but can I ask, do you know then if you take disability out of it, just people in general, is there a wage gap between unionized and non-unionized workers? That there is a wage gap there. So is your data then measuring an extra differential in wages that you'd expect from disability? You see what I mean? So there would be a difference, but it's not picking up an additional difference due to disability.
That's exactly.
Well, then the unions are working, aren't they? Because that's what they're there for, isn't it? It's not that they're not there specifically to generate differentials in wages specifically across disability groups, but across people in general, right?
So yeah, I'm not saying unions don't have a function,
but
I'm saying the unions don't have the function in terms of addressing inequality that is perhaps hypothesized. If you read the literature about them being sort of protective of, so they might protect lower income groups who still, that's not necessarily inconsistent. But what we're not finding is that they're protecting disabled individuals any more than anybody.
But they spoke, I mean, is that the objective of I didn't realise that was an objective of a union. I thought it was to protect people that may be on relatively low wages otherwise, or suffer occupational, hazards otherwise. It's not, purpose of a union wasn't to reduce inequalities and disabilities.
I agree, it's not the sole purpose of a union, but if you think about their disability champions and their equality sort of roles, then presumably they do have a proactive, otherwise why have they got those roles? So yes, I don't believe it's their core function, and I'm not saying unions are not important in many other respects, which clearly is beyond the paper, but in terms of any additional benefit they have for disabled.
So that was my question. Was it worth waiting for?
Yeah, thank you. Great. With that, we'll say thank you very much to everybody for questions, but especially thanks very much for Melanie. Welcome back to the seminar world. So on behalf of everybody, thanks very much.